Hello, and welcome to the Vancouver Writers Fest. My name is Leslie Hertig, and I'm the Artistic Director. I'm really glad that you could join us here this afternoon to meet David A. Robertson and hear him talk about his new book, The Barren Grounds. Before we go there, I'd like to share a message with you from Rebecca Duncan of the Squamish Nation.
Oseam Tanoya, Titachama Queen Quashamin, Rebecca Queensna, Skotmishchin, Etina Chantla, Homatsquim o Homech Eman. Yoan Hartlin Squaw and Quistlak no more yap HT, Nati come alai o Homech. Skotmish o Homatsquim o Etzelewatol, Hi to Mechchit. Hello, everybody. My true name is Titachama. I am from the Squamish Nation, and it is my honor to welcome you to our beautiful territory we call Kamkamalai, known as Vancouver, where all the maple trees are. It is shared territory between the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. Very sacred land for us. And we are part of the Coast Salish family, which means we are people of the cedar. As you can see, my beautiful yellow cedar cape. We utilize cedar for our canoes, our baskets, our tools, our clothing, many, many things. We are also people of the salmon, people of the longhouse. The longhouse for us is our church, our hospital, and our school. We go there to learn, to heal, and to pray. We are also people of the canoes. So welcome to our territory. We are excited to have you here. And by acknowledging you and acknowledging our ancestors will take care of you and welcome you to our land. Oseam.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work, and this event you're about to watch today on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're very grateful to be here. I would also like to thank our government sponsors today, CMHC Granville Island, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Province of British Columbia, the BC Arts Council, and the City of Vancouver. We couldn't put this festival on without your support. I'm pretty sure that David A. Robertson was the first author that we invited to our festival this year. When my colleague Clea Young and I first heard that he had not one but two new books coming out this fall, we jumped at the chance to invite him back. This is because he is a smart and funny and intelligent storyteller that is so great at connecting with his audience. He's the winner of a 2017 Governor General's Award, among others, and the author of numerous books for young readers. He has a knack for exploring important themes in our lives and our society here in Canada today. The Barren Grounds is the first in a new middle grade series, the Misewa Saga, and he's going to tell us more about that. He's a member of the Norway House Cree Nation, and he's coming to us today from Winnipeg. Please welcome David A. Robertson.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of the festival this year. It is a honor and a privilege to be back here. And it is nice to be in front of all of you today. I wish that I could see you. One of the great joys of being a writer is, to me, is to be able to go around and to see people face to face, to meet people, to have conversations with people, and we're doing the best we can now to do that. But unfortunately, you can see me and I can't see you. But we will make do, and I hope everybody is safe out there and healthy and doing well in these difficult times. I would like to take questions from you near the end, and I think that if there are questions that come up, they'll feed them into my chat here. and I'll be able to answer them for you. I would love to be able to do that. And other than that, I'm just going to talk about the Barren Grounds. And I wish that I would have brought a copy of it to show you, but I did not do that because I did not plan ahead. But this is what the Barren Grounds is. This is the cover of the Barren Grounds. And so it is the first book, as Leslie had said, of a series called the Misewa Saga. And I'm happy to say that the second book is I'm hard at work at it right now, and it'll be out next fall in 2021. And hopefully by that time we will be all together, and I'll be able to see some of you face to face. But this is an exciting series for me. It is something that I wanted to do for a long time. It's a story that I wanted to tell for a long time. And what I want to do is, after kind of introducing myself, just to talk about where this series came from and the influences of it, all the many influences and inspirations that went into creating what the Barren Grounds became. Um, a little bit about myself, just so you kind of are aware of me and my identity. I am part Cree. My dad was Cree. He was born in a community called Norway House Cree Nation, which is about 8 hours north of Winnipeg by car. 7 if you're really anxious to get there. And my mom is English, Irish, and Scottish, and so I am mixed ancestry, but I'm very proud of all of who I am, but I have a very strong connection to my Cree roots. I'm a band member of Norway House Cree Nation, which is very important to me. One of the things that I have done in the last couple of years that has been very profoundly has had a profound impact on me is my visit to my dad's trapline, which did go into some of the work in the Barren Grounds when the kids go onto the trap line in this other reality called ski, which is just a Cree word for earth. And this is a portal story, so the kids spend a lot of time in this other reality. And so a lot of the things that they do on the trap line was informed by some of the experiences and teachings my dad gave me while we were out there. I'm here in Winnipeg, speaking to wherever you are. I have 5 children myself, all the way from 5 years old to 17. And they are readers of my work and also very good critics. And so they've been helpful in constructing some of the stories here and some of the authenticity of the characters and what they say or don't say. I like hearing from my kids sometimes, Dad, 13-year-old would never say that. And so I can kind of have that resource available to me. Anyway, so that's a little bit about me. But we have about 45 minutes or so together. And I want to spend that time talking about the book. I'd like to do a reading from the book for you. And what I'd like to start off with is to tell you kind of where this book came from. And what I find really interesting about being a writer is that stories come from a lot of different places. They come to us in a lot of different ways. And I find that really exciting because sometimes, you have these epiphany moments where the story just presents itself to you. And that's very exciting. I call, kind of like a light bulb moment where all of a sudden that story is just there. And it seems like the words almost present themselves to you and you just kind of dictate them down. That doesn't happen very often. Writing is a lot of work. But my picture book, When We Were Alone, was like that. It was just this kind of moment where the title came to me and the words came to me, and I felt like I was channeling experiences of a lot of the survivors of the schools and people that did not survive, like my grandmother. She went to residential school. She survived the residential school, but that story just flowed through me. And stories come to us sometimes like that. So they can arrive like that. Stories can come from curiosity. our need to explore the world and the world in which we live, to understand the world in which we live, the things that we don't know but have always wanted to. And I find that, one of the things that I know, this isn't a writing workshop, but one of the things that I tell writers often is, we hear a lot, write what you know. And I think that we shouldn't do that. I think that we should write, from our passions, which is completely different. But we should also write to understand the world better. Because if we're not learning ourselves, then how are we going to teach anybody anything, right? And I think that is something that I have taken to heart in my work, is when I write stories, I'm learning. And for the books that I have, including the Barren Grounds, um, I have things to say and teach within that story. Now, you can read the story and just have fun. I hope you have fun reading it, and this, really exciting adventure that these kids go on. But if you look below the surface, and I'll talk about some of these things, if you look below the surface, there are things to learn. And there are things that I had to educate myself first about. So we write out of our curiosities. We write to understand the world that we're living in. And sometimes right now, I think that some stories that you'll find created right now are like that, where we're trying to understand the state of the world right now. And stories are going to help us understand that, and to understand, where we're at and where we want to be and where we might be, in a year, in 2 years, and in 10 years, 5 years. Um, and then stories, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, stories can come from a need to educate. And that's where a lot of my books have come from. And I've written about 25 books in my career over the last 11 years or so. And all my books have been written to educate in some way. Now, every book has a message. If you don't have a message, there's no story. But I have a very particular focus to educate everybody, but in particular youth. I want youth to be exposed to stories that teach them things that, as a kid, I never was taught. And I think that that's important that writers do that. In particular, marginalized writers, writers of color, writers from, the LGBTQIA community, because we have truths to share that I think are important for youth to carry forward, so that they can become better leaders, because they are our leaders of tomorrow. And so I have a need to educate through my stories, and I think that stories come from sometimes a need to educate, something that you see that needs to be talked about and taught that maybe hasn't been before, or hasn't been yet. And that's something that, I find a lot of my stories come from. Um, and then sometimes they are these seeds that have been planted. Maybe it's an experience you had, maybe it's a person you've met, maybe it's something you've gone through, and that seed slowly starts to grow until it's ready to be cultivated and made into something. And all this to say, the Barren Grounds kind of is all of that. And so sometimes books aren't all of that, but the Barren Grounds in a way is all of that, and I kind of want to break down why, like, how is that, how is it all of that. And so the first seed of this story, the Barren Grounds, which is really, it's a middle grade fantasy series, fantasy book, where these two Cree children, foster children, Morgan and Eli, discover a portal. First of all, how to open a portal, and to discover a portal into another reality, which is this world called Aski. And in this reality, on this world, there are these animal beings, which are living traditionally like, Cree people used to live. And these two foster children find that in living in this world, they begin to connect with the things that they have lost. And as much as they go on this journey to help save the world that they found, they also save themselves through very personal journeys towards their own identities. And that's kind of like a short little synopsis about the book. But the seed for this book really came from a novel I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago called The Evolution of Alice. And it was an adult book, an adult literary fiction. And there was a short story, because it's a collection of short stories. It was a short story in that book, where character Gideon moved into an apartment in Winnipeg, and he found these like tack holes in a slanted wall, and he had no idea where these tack holes came from. And he found that this apartment is haunted by this young woman, the ghost of this young woman. And what he finds out is that this young woman used to be in the foster care system, and tragically passed away, but she used to tack up pictures on the wall. And in these pictures, she used to stare at them and imagine herself in a better place. And so I loved that concept. And that story, I had a backstory to it that I wrote that didn't make it into the book, called The Imagination Room, which talked about her life as a child and how she made these pictures and escaped into them in her mind. And obviously, the mind and our imaginations are such powerful things that sometimes when we visit places in our mind, we actually feel like we're going there. And I love that. So in that way, it was kind of a portal story. Even though she didn't physically go into this other world, she escaped with her mind. And I love that idea. And so that was the seed. That was the seed from the Barren Grounds. Now, eventually, I repurposed that idea for a middle grade audience, because that was going to be it was going to be like an adult literary book, originally called The Imagination Room. And I decided eventually that I wanted to write it as a middle grade fantasy novel. And so, but that was the seed of it. A lot of other influences played into where the Barren Grounds came from. One of them was the Cree stories of the sky and the stars, and that's something that I've become increasingly more interested in. Is Cree stories of the sky and constellations, and we have our own stories about these things. The Big Dipper, for example, in Western society was what we call that constellation, is the Big Dipper constellation. In the Cree culture, we have a different name for that, and we have a story about how that constellation came to be. And I want to kind of read to you a quick little paragraph about some research around that Cree constellation, the Cree view of that constellation. And this is where I kind of found an avenue through which I could share that portal story. And so it's research by a scientist, a Cree scientist named Wilfred Buck. And he has a great research paper on all these sky stories, all these legends about the sky and the constellations. And so this paragraph here talks about how the late Murdo Scribe called this constellation Ochekotacosuk, which is the Fisher stars. And so one of the main characters in the Barren Grounds is the Fisher, who is named Ochek. And I'll just read to you. The story spoke of how at some point in the distant past, there was no summer in this part of the world, which I called in the Barren Grounds the North Country. What may be interesting to note regarding the story is that the reference to no summer could be connected to a time of cold like the Ice Age. So a lot of our stories, our creation stories, our legends, can be actually correlated to world history, like things that happened in the world in the past, like the Ice Age, a notion that is kept alive through this story. The story goes on to say that certain animals were selected to bring summer to the northern hemisphere. And the animal that succeeded in this task with help from other animals was Ochek. And Ochek is a Cree word for fisher, which is an animal. And to honor the success of this great task that the fisher had accomplished in bringing summer back to the northern hemisphere, Creator, which is God, placed Fisher into the sky to remind us of what was then, what is now, as well as the possibility of what could be again if we do not respect what is loaned to us. And when we talk about that, we're talking about the environment, the land, And that's kind of where also the word Misawa comes from. So it's the Misewa Saga. There's a village on a ski called Misawa, and Misawa is a Cree word which means all that is. So all that is above the earth and below the sky. And so Misawa is what that means. And so it's a fascinating story. And so Ochek in the story, I won't give anything away actually, because if I tell you what happens to Ochek, I will ruin the Barren Grounds for you. But so that's that. The stories of the sky have always really interested me. They have fascinated me. I love them. And um, there are what would you call it? There are teachings in these stories that apply to our lives that we can incorporate into our lives, morals. And so the Ochek Fisher story has a moral. And every single book in the Misawa Saga is going to be adapted from a story of the sky. Book 2 is about the Great Bear, which is another constellation in the sky. And I won't tell you much about book 2, but it's very exciting to me to be able to do that, because what I'm trying to do is to keep these stories alive for future generations, both for Cree children who need to have these stories documented and passed down, as that's how we used to share stories, is to pass down from one generation to the next. And also for non-Indigenous children, non-Cree children, to be able to read stories and appreciate the life in these stories, the beauty in these stories. And I think that's also important to be able to do that. So it comes from these Cree legends. And so if you think about the fact that these animals were living in this eternal winter, Narnia might come to mind. And, really almost every single article or review of the Barren Grounds compares it to the Chronicles of Narnia. And that's fair. I did think a lot about the Chronicles of Narnia when I wrote this middle grade fantasy book and the subsequent book. And I have Narnia as a very important inspiration to the entire series. It was a book that, like many of us, I read while growing up. And it was one of the books that I, really loved as a kid. Another book that I loved as a kid that inspired the series was Tom's Midnight Garden. And so if anybody here has read Tom's Midnight Garden, um, then you know how great it is. If you have not read it, then look it up and read it, because it's really an incredible middle grade book as well. And what it does is it plays with the construct of time. And it's also a portal story. And in this story, Tom, as the grandfather clock strikes 13, Tom is able to open the back door of a flat into a portal into a different time, not a different reality, but a different time. And he meets this girl at different stages of her life. And it's just a brilliant, brilliant book. And Tom's Midnight Garden is a book that really inspires more of book 2 than book 1, which might give you a hint about what book 2 is a little bit about. So you kind of get a little bit of sneak peek at some of what book 2's inspirations are. But the Chronicles of Narnia was very important for me. Obviously, in the line in The Witch in the Wardrobe, they are living through as well an eternal winter. And so there were parallels between The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Fisher legend. And another thing I've been really interested in is how I can look at classical literature and I can subversively address some influences, impacts on Indigenous people by some of the themes that have existed in classical literature. And as many of you know, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia in general was a very overt Christian story. And, from community to community and across Turtle Island or Canada, Christianity has had, or depending on the community, a very negative impact on First Nations people. Not always, but often. And so what I wanted to do was to take the very instruments that had created barriers to break down those barriers. And so using the Chronicles of Narnia as an inspiration for the Misewa Saga allowed me to tell a portal story like that, not through a Christian lens, but through an Indigenous lens. And I thought that was really interesting to be able to do that. Other things that I've tried to do in my career have been similar. Comics had a very negative impact on me when I was growing up because of how Indigenous people were represented within the pages of comics. They were always represented very negatively, or very stereotypically. They're always shamans, or they always had these, bare bare-chested, or they're always, had headdresses, and they were savages, or noble savages, or bloodthirsty savages, and so they had this really negative impact on my self-perception because that's what I believed Indigenous people to be. And so one of the reasons why I've written so many graphic novels that have had accurate representations of Indigenous people was to break down the barriers that comics had created. And so I feel like it's a appropriate and a really interesting practice to be able to repurpose some of these things that have traditionally created barriers, or have had negative impacts on Indigenous communities and peoples, and to repurpose them to build our youth, our communities back up. And so that's another thing I've tried to do with the Barren Grounds. And this is not to say that Narnia, I love those books. And so it's not to throw shade on C.S. Lewis at all, but it's trying to use that inspiration for good, to be able to empower our youth in a way that they have not been empowered by. And that's where this series also kind of was developed, to look at representation and to see, Cree heroes that are center stage, that have, really well developed characters, backgrounds. They have agency over their lives, over the stories. They have control over what they do. They have really important roles to play in the stories and how they work to save the world. And listen, we need more heroes of color. We just do. We need kids who are, you know, kids of color, Black kids, Indigenous kids. We need kids who are from the LGBT community to read heroes from the LGBT community. It's empowering to see ourselves represented in literature. It is also equally powerful to have non-Indigenous children, in this instance, read Indigenous kids who are heroes in their stories. Because it starts to break down stereotypes, it starts to break down perceptions that have been built up, that have been very negative historically and still today. And so that is something I also have had in mind with the Barren Grounds quite often, is how am I representing Indigenous kids? Oh, sorry, I think I paused for a second there. How am I representing Indigenous kids? Why am I representing Indigenous kids? And to work towards doing that truthfully and accurately and positively for the betterment of any kid reading the story, or adult, frankly. And so that representation has been a really big focus of my work and for this book. And finally, before I read you an excerpt, I wanted to talk about some contemporary issues that I think are very important to have discussions about. So hopefully, if kids read this book, they can have discussions with their parents or teachers about some of the contemporary issues that this book brings up, as much as they have, fun reading an adventure story. The Barren Grounds talks about, when I mentioned Cree foster children, it talks about the foster care system. And one thing I want kids to consider is how removing children from their families, their cultures, their communities um, impacts them in a very negative way. And that detachment has a profound impact on our youth, Indigenous youth. And we talk a lot about how, as well, the foster care system has more kids in care today than ever attended residential schools. And so I want to talk about how a lot of these systems that were in place in the past are still in place today. And we can do that in a way that's age appropriate. I think the Barren Grounds does that. So we're not looking at all to traumatize children or to re-traumatize children. We are looking at educating kids about important things that they should know about and be aware of. And I think that this book does that in regards to how it addresses the foster care system. And finally, about land protection and land ownership and the environment. Oh, I think I cut out. I don't know if I'm cutting out or if something's happening, but how the Barren Grounds also deals with land protection, land stewardship, and the environment, and that's something that I also very overtly tried to address within the pages of the Barren Grounds. And so, obviously, talking about the weather and this eternal winter, and the reasons why this eternal winter has been thrust upon this world. I won't give away why, but the reasons why and what's happening is something that we can really relate to, especially today. Land ownership, land protection, and treaty rights are something that we should really be aware of. And a lot of things are happening in Canada today that are having a very negative impact on Indigenous peoples and communities. And if we inform kids about these things in ways that they can understand and grow empathy for, I think that we are preparing kids to change the way things are for tomorrow for the better. And so that's kind of, I know I talked for probably half an hour already now about all these things, but they're important to me. And I think that they're important for everybody. They should be important for everybody to know about and to learn from. And so what I just want to remind you of, if you do have questions, I think you're watching this on YouTube. You can throw comments onto there, and I think they'll be fed into my chat here for me to answer. But what I'd like to do after I've kind of given this long preamble about what the Barren Grounds is and where it came from, I'd like to do a reading from it for you. And then after that, I'll talk to you about kind of what's to come in the Misawa Saga as we move forward. And then hopefully there'll be some questions that I can answer from all of you beautiful people that are out there somewhere in the world. So this is a section of the story where Morgan and Eli have begin to find out that there is something magical that is happening with the drawings that Eli, who's the younger foster sibling, the drawings that he creates. And so what the foster kids have done, Morgan and Eli, is they have found a secret room in this attic that is being renovated. And they decide that they're going to make this secret room their place to hide out and to read and to draw and to hang out together, to escape from kind of the pain of some of the stuff that they're going through at school and at home. And so they decide they're going to decorate the room, and they begin to put this paper, this drawing that Eli made of this wintry landscape and this animal creature that is in this drawing. They start to tack it onto the wall, and as they tack it onto the wall, something amazing happens. And I'm going to read to you that section of when they make this discovery of that this drawing actually opens a portal into another reality. So here we go. A gust of air blew out of the paper, much stronger than before. Morgan's entire head of hair blew backward, as if a hairdryer had been turned on to maximum power. But as quickly as the gust came, it was gone. Whoa, Morgan said. That came from the paper, Eli stated. It totally did. They stared at the picture, then at each other. Eli nodded at Morgan, giving her permission to add another staple. Another gust of wind, this one stronger still, and it was cold wind. It stung Morgan's cheeks, already raw from crying. This can't be happening, she said. And why now? Why not when I was drawing downstairs? Eli asked. Good question. Maybe, okay, don't think this is cheesy. but maybe we have to be together. But why? I don't know. Morgan threw her hand in the air. I'm trying to think like this is a fantasy book. Maybe we have to be in the attic, Eli said. It's kind of sweeter if it's us, not a room, just saying. Sorry? Just kidding. I'm trying not to freak out. These things don't happen in real life. Oh. Morgan pressed the staple gun against another corner of the drawing. Should I? Yeah. Thwack. An avalanche of freezing air burst through the paper and pushed both of them back, almost to the opposite wall. And then it was gone. Morgan's hair was crazy, like she'd just woken up or stuck a finger in an electrical socket. Even Eli's hair, usually perfectly braided, slick and beautiful, had strands blown out of place. The attic was cold. The wind had come out like a lightning bolt, abruptly stopping each time, and it left behind a lingering chill. There was one corner left to staple. Morgan placed the staple gun against the last corner. Ready? She asked. Ready, he said. Thwack. The blizzard in the drawing, once just pencil lines, stormed into the attic room. The kids stumbled backwards against the wall. Morgan tried to move to the side, out of the way of the wind, but there was no escaping it. And this time it was unrelenting. It wasn't just the wind either. Snow was pouring into the room, so fast and hard that it stung against Morgan's skin. She raised her arm in front of her face to shield it from the onslaught. Eli did the same. Within seconds, the floor was covered in white flakes. Morgan peeked over her arm to look at the paper fastened to the wall. It had been a drawing, but not anymore. Now, it was a window. But the window didn't open to the world outside the house. It opened to the world that Eli had created, the world that Morgan had pictured that morning. She could see the blizzard, both in the attic and in the picture. She could see the near endless field of snow. She could see just barely the tree line far in the distance. She could see shimmering lights like tiny stars from the village. And she could see the fisher. The animal being was walking towards them, at first slowly, then it broke into a run. Snow kicked up behind it. Morgan screamed. Eli rushed forward, ripped the paper away from the wood, and the other world was gone. It's ice cold, Eli said, dropping it. It floated to the ground like a snowflake. Morgan and Eli stood there, staring at each other for a long while, until Morgan whispered, "Pick up the drawing." It was on the floor, and the melting snow was beginning to dampen the paper. I just let it go. Why do I have to do it? Eli asked. It's your drawing, Morgan said. Plus, I'm older. Eli kicked at the drawing first. A few snowflakes coughed out of it, but nothing more. He bent over, tapped at it a few times, then picked it up. He turned it over slowly to reveal that the picture was exactly as he'd drawn it. The snow, the trees, the village. Only now, the fisher seemed closer than he had before, and stuck in mid-run, coming right at them. So that was an excerpt from the Barren Grounds, and it's a very kind of exciting part of the book where the kids obviously they open this portal and all this kind of snow like floods into the attic as they kind of work their way towards this new opening and to try and see what this world is all about. And Ochek, at the time they just know him as the fisher, sees it too, and so he comes charging at them to see like what is open in this great tree that they come out of. They come out of this big great tree, and then fun stuff happens. And so the Barren Grounds, they come into this village called Misewa, which is obviously, I said this before, it means all that is, and it's populated by these walking, talking animals, and they're starving. They because of how long the winter has been among them, they they're starving out, they're dying out, and it isn't long before the kids and Ochek and a squirrel named Eric, which is Eric Watchus, which is just Cree for squirrel, realize that they have to go on this adventure to try and bring back the summer before the villagers in Misewa die. And so they go on this very exciting adventure to try and save the world. And I won't tell you what happens. So I have a question here. And it just says, David, can you tell us about the different genres you work in and what you enjoy most? Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I tell a lot of emerging writers and young writers is two things, two very important things. One of them is, if you want to be a really good writer, you have to read. So, you read a lot of books. And I tell writers as well to read widely. So read a lot of different genres, a lot of different forms of literature. And at the same time, you need to write a lot to get better at writing. It's just like practice. And so I write all the time. And I also write widely. So I say, as much as I read widely, I like to write widely. And I like to do that because a few reasons. All the different forms I work in and write in. I work in graphic novels, poetry, which I'm probably the worst at. Poetry is so hard. Middle grade, young adult, memoir. My memoir called Blackwater just came out last month, and it is also about a search for identity, but I'm the guy searching for identity with my father. I work in adult literary fiction, so all these different forms of literature. And I do that for two reasons. One of them is because for the work that I have, in terms of people I want to educate, I want to be able to reach as many people as possible. And to do that, I need to tell stories in a lot of different forms of literature to reach a wide audience. So it's not so much for me to try and to sell a lot of books so I can make money. Writers don't make a ton of money from royalties and stuff like that, unless you're like, John Grisham. But I want to be able to reach people to educate them. That's the focus of my work. The other reason is because I want to become a better writer. And if we are stagnant, if we work in only one area all the time, we won't be developing skills that will help us to improve in our practice. And I want to be, one of the best writers in Canada. I'm not, but if I challenge myself to write all these different forms of literature all the time, I'm getting better all the time at the practice of writing, which helps me in the long run. And the writing that I enjoy most right now is probably picture book writing. I'm probably the best at it. And I'm not saying that just because When We Were Alone, won the Governor General's. I have two picture books coming out with Tundra over the next 2 years that I really, really love. And I think are very, very good. One of them is illustrated by Julie Flett, which is coming out next year, called On the Trapline. And then I have another one in next year, which is a secret. So I won't tell you anything about it, but it's a very much a departure for me. But I love writing picture books. And I found that I really love writing middle grade literature too. So those are two things that I'm speaking to me a lot right now. Memoir was very hard to write, but I also really loved the experience of writing Blackwater. But those are two things. Those are the things, why the genres I work in and what I enjoy most. Another question. You speak about the legacy of family and the importance of that. Can you tell us what legacy you hope to leave for your children? That's a great question. I'll tell you two things, I guess. One of the things is, I asked my dad one day. My dad passed away in December. I asked him, why didn't you teach me how to be Indigenous? Because the long story, you have to read Blackwater for this. I'm not trying to sell my other book, but I grew up very disconnected from my Indigenous identity because partly because my parents were separated as I was growing up in my formative years. They got back together later in life and when I was about in high school. But so I was very disconnected in the 80s. And so Um, I asked him, why didn't you teach me about, what it means to be Indigenous? I asked him that last year. And he said, how am I going to teach you how to be Indigenous? You are Indigenous. So nothing I teach you can make you more or less Indigenous. The focus of my father and my mother were to raise me to be a good human being, to be a good man. And so I want that to be a legacy, a leap to my children. I just want them to grow up to be good people. I want them to grow up to respect people, to understand that to know people, you really have to talk to them. You can't make assumptions about who anybody is until you actually know them. And that's something that I want to impart to my children. I think that's very important. That sort of respect for others, and respect for yourself. I also want them to be proud of who they are as Indigenous people. My wife's Métis. I'm Cree. So I want them to understand and be proud of their Cree Métis background. And I want them to give them the tools to find out what that means for themselves, which is what my parents did for me. And so those are two things that I would really like to leave for my children. And a lot of that is legacy that has been passed down from my father, but I'd like that for my children. That's a really good question. How old were you when you thought about becoming an author? Yeah, so this is a story I tell every talk I give, actually, and it's a kind of a fun story. We find that in our lives we figure out what we want to do at different stages, and sometimes it comes to us like a lightning bolt, like I mentioned lightning bolt in the story, like this flash, this epiphany, and we just think, this is what I want to do for my life. And for me, I was in grade 3. I was 8 years old, and my teacher, Mrs. Ratuski, um, gave us an assignment to write poetry. And I took my paper and my pencil and I left my desk. I was a shy kid, and I still like writing in the dark too. So this is probably why also. But I went into the closet, I shut the door, and I was in the dark all by myself. And I started writing poetry. And as soon as I started writing these poems, I just fell in love with writing. I fell in love with creating poetry. I fell in love with creating stories. And I wrote about 10 or 12 poems that day, and I brought them up to my teacher. She made them into this booklet for me. It was, I still have the booklet today. And I ran home to my mom that day and I said, Mom, I want to be a writer. And that was when I was 8 years old. And ever since that time, I have only ever wanted to be a writer. It's the only thing I've ever had a dream for. It's the only career I've ever had a focus on. And so I'm really lucky to be, I mean, part of it's luck, but a lot of it's hard work. But I guess a better word is I'm grateful to be able to do what I do, and to do things like this. Like this is a really nothing more than a privilege to be able to, be asked to come and speak to you about my books and to read from them and to go across Canada and talk about them. It's such an amazing thing to be able to do that. And so it started when I was 8 years old, a long, long time ago. I'm older than 8 by decades right now. So, how long did it take you to write the Barren Grounds? Yeah, so the Barren Grounds. So what you have to understand with writing too, and I kind of talk as though some of you are interested in writing. I don't know that, but the Barren Grounds took me 6-7 months or so to write. Now I know someone on here from Penguin might be watching and they might correct me. Maybe it was longer than that, but I the so the first draft took about 2 months. But then editing, revising, fixing, all that stuff, it takes at least 3 or 4 times that long. So the Barren Grounds probably took, I would say, 6-7 months or so to write until I was ready to go to publication. So that's how long it takes. Every book's different, but I would say every book takes at least half a year or more to write, and to get it where it needs to be. I can write a first draft pretty quickly, but the revising process, editing, refining, making it what it needs to be, that's where the work really comes in. That's where the hard work really comes in. New question. Is the Barren Grounds meant to be a parallel to what's happening in the world today with the environmental crisis? That's a really good question. Yes, I think that there are things in the Barren Grounds that are very overtly meant to parallel things that are going on in the world today. And I kind of mentioned that earlier, but yeah, I mean, like the things that are going on right now in terms of the treaty rights, in terms of land protection, and the rights to even hunt and be on lands that traditionally Indigenous peoples have been on since time immemorial, are issues that are very important to me. I know what's going on right now in Canada and a lot of the struggles and things that Indigenous peoples are facing. And it saddens me. And I want kids to be educated about these things, to think about the environment and to think about land stewardship and protection, to think about the environment and the climate. I think are, things that are not very subtly hidden messages of the Barren Grounds. And just like the foster care system, I want people to understand and know about the impacts of the foster care system. I don't want it to be an indictment of the foster parents across Canada. I think a lot of them do their best. I think it's the system that's broken that we need to fix. And so there are a lot of messages in the Barren Grounds that are meant to parallel real world issues that I think that kids can get. Kids are complex, smart, and they can understand these things that they're reading, and they're better for it. To be able to expose kids to literature that educate them, that they can carry forward, and to, like I said earlier, to make better decisions for us as they go forward and become leaders for us. Our job is to educate them and to make sure that they have the knowledge to be able to do that. And I think stories have a very important role in that process. Thank you so much for tuning in and for spending this time with me. Again, I think Leslie's going to come on here, but I just wanted to say thank you to Leslie and to the Vancouver Writers Festival for asking me to be here. And thank you again for tuning in and for watching.
Thank you, David, so much for joining us. I know I said before, I wish you were here in person. We hope you'll come visit us again in Vancouver sometime when things are different. But in the meantime, thank you for sharing the Barren Grounds with us. We look forward to the second book in the series, and we'll spread the word about that. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.